Okay, so thank you all, like I said, for joining us for our second session of our virtual workshop exploring the clean energy transition in the Great Lakes. Today, we are going to get a little more focused on specific parts of this transition. We spent a lot of time on our first session talking about just energy writ large and the sources of production that new electricity would come from and that kind of part of the transition. And today we're going to pivot into talking about things like the grid and specifically the transmission part of that, as well as transportation and electric vehicles. And then we're going to end the day with a session on building codes and energy efficiency and the roles that's going to play in decarbonization. So to start us off this morning, we have an awesome panel of speakers to tell us basically how one of the biggest things that this is all going to take is getting the new energy we make to where it needs to go and how we go about doing that. And to tell us that story, we have Natalie McIntyre and Tyler Hubner and Jeremiah Donner. And they are, as you will soon, I'll just let you know who they all work for and who we're going to hear first from Natalie, I believe, and she's with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Natalie is a senior advocate for NRDC's Sustainable Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC for short, project. She focuses on expanding the transmission grid and improving electricity market rules to support the clean energy transition. Natalie advocates before FERC and on behalf of the Sustainable FERC project and other environmental groups in grid operator stakeholder processes. Her focus is on the Midwest, Great Plains, and the South, which covers the MISO and SPP regional transmission operators service areas. Before NRDC, Natalie worked for over 20 years for clean energy industry nonprofits, and she holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, a master's in the history of science and technology, and a graduate certificate in applied energy economics and policy. After Natalie speaks, we're going to hear from Tyler. And Tyler, in March 2022, was appointed by Governor Tony Evers here in Wisconsin to serve as a commissioner on the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. His term started in earnest in March 2021, and it ended unceremoniously last month when the GOP-controlled legislature basically fired him from that role. The news reporting on that I find hilarious. Among other things, he made it easier for some customers to afford their utility bills, which was a cited reason for his dismissal. He played a significant role while he was there in utility regulation as a member of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and as Wisconsin's representative on the MISO States Board. Before all this, Tyler led Renew Wisconsin, a nonprofit focused on clean energy, and contributed to energy efficiency initiatives at both state and federal levels. Tyler has his master's from Stanford and a bachelor's from the University of Iowa, and he lives where I do, here in Madison, with his family. And then finally, we'll hear from Jeremiah. Jeremiah has been with the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO, which we've heard a lot about in the first session of this workshop, for 17 years with various roles across the organization. His current role is in transmission planning as the Director of Cost Allocation and Competitive Transmission, focusing on MISO's reliability imperative work on long-range transmission planning and cost allocation. He was hired by MISO out of college, and his first role focused on transmission cost allocation, including supporting the development of MISO's multi-value project provisions. After 7 years working in transmission planning, he took multiple roles in different parts of the organization and has worked on everything from strategy and business development to external affairs, focusing on SEAMS policies and new member integrations. He holds his bachelor's and master's in economics from Illinois State University. So those are the three speakers we're going to be hearing from. And I believe Natalie's up first, and I've made you a co-host.
Okay,
So
I'll see if I can share.
we'll
And I
see
just
how.
want to, I mean, I'm going to go first, but did you want to switch our times? Because I thought we were going from me to Jeremiah to
Oh, I'm
Tyler.
sorry, you're
Is that
correct. Yeah, I
okay?
just had I
Yep.
had the bios written up in the
No,
wrong order.
I just wanted to make sure that we all knew what was
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
down the pike
you,
if there were any
Jeremiah, then
shifts.
Tyler. That's right.
So, okay, let me see if I can get this screen sharing going. This looks a little bit different. Uh, hmm. I I don't see, let me see if I can do something because I can't tell what is what here.
Okay.
But if I close something else, I might be able to do it.
I wonder if can I ask you to share screen?
No, I think it's a problem on my end.
Oh, okay.
Um, because usually when I try to share, it will give me an image of what I'm
Yeah.
trying to share, and I'm not getting images. So I'm gonna hope that this works.
And if it doesn't, I've got your thing queued up and we can
Okay, and it's
go
telling
through
me
mine.
I need to open my system preferences, so I don't know why that is happening.
How about if you want,
There.
Natalie, I can just share my screen and I've got your slide deck up.
Okay. Okay, that would be great.
Okay,
Maybe we
cool.
should have tried this 10 minutes ago.
That's all right. Yeah,
Um,
here we go. Okay.
Normally it works fine for me, but
That's what always happens. It works
you know.
99% of the time until it doesn't. So here we go.
Anyway, I'll dive in. Thanks for the introduction, and glad to be with you all today talking about the grid and the role of the grid in the clean energy transition. I'm a senior advocate for the Sustainable FERC project, which is a project of NRDC, housed within NRDC. And I've been doing this work, advocating on behalf of the interests of renewable energy, in terms of transmission and markets, and sort of addressing rules and regulations, paving the path so that we have sort of an equal playing field for these resources in our energy mix for about 20 years. So, or maybe more. Let's just stop counting. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll just briefly mention a little bit more about the Sustainable FERC project. It was created in 1995 by a small group of clean energy environmental organizations. At that point, most environmental organizations did not have any understanding of FERC or how the federal energy regulatory process worked. And so this project was created, and we work very much in coalitions with other advocates, uh, and involved in the FERC process itself, involved in stakeholder processes within the RTOs and the ISOs, and also various federal forums. So you can see sort of a smattering of some of those other coalition partners below. Let's go to the next slide. This is very busy, but I just want to sort of paint the picture here. We're talking about the grid, which has so many benefits. The role of the grid is basically to tie our generation to the cities and the towns, the farms, the businesses. They're going to use that electricity. So we have all kinds of benefits from this robust grid, from just reliability to supporting new economic opportunities, and the point that we're trying to talk about today, supporting the clean energy transition. So let's dig into that a little bit more with the next slide here. First of all, just want to kind of highlight what I think of as the primary functions of our transmission grid. We've got to deliver electricity from generation to load. Unless you have solar panels on your roof with the batteries, you're going to need some kind of transmission or distribution line to bring that power to your home or to your business. And really the role there in terms of the grid is to try to avoid customer outages. We all know that those aren't fun, and our utilities, our transmission operators, our RTOs, ISOs know that reliability is their #1 job, and they do an excellent job of that, considering how complicated a machine the grid is. The next function is really to allow new generators to come onto the system, as well as allowing older generators to come off the system. So you've already talked about, I guess, all the various clean energy resources. Many more of those are coming onto the grid, and we need to have a very strong and robust grid to be able to accept those new generators onto the grid. You might not think about it, but in fact, we also sometimes have to make adjustments to our transmission grid to allow older generators to retire and come off of the grid in order to maintain stability there. And the last thing in terms of the key functions of the grid is really efficient energy markets. We want to be able to move power around the system, around the grid, in order to get the least cost power to the consumers. And this image that I pulled up here from a MISO Market Monitors report shows kind of what can happen if we don't have enough transmission to move power across regions. We get situations where we've got low cost power in one part of the region, which is like the blue area on this grid. And then we've got high cost power in the red part of the region. And what's happening here with this price separation in this image is that we don't have enough capacity to move the power from the low cost area to the high cost area. This is, I mean, when we think about the grid, we often compare it to a highway system. So it could be like traffic on the highway and, you know, traffic not being able to move from one area to the other. Sometimes people use the analogy of piping. So if you were trying to move water through a pipe system, this might be a situation where you don't have a pipe that's quite big enough to move the amount of water that you want to move. So that's what we have sometimes when we don't have enough transmission to really support the most efficient markets. So let's move to the next slide then. So we're really talking today, like, how do we need to change the transmission grid in order to support this clean energy transition? And really, I mean, I think you probably have already talked about this in your earlier presentations, it sounds like, Adam, but I want to start by noting that the transitioning the electricity grid in our country is really one of the most cost-effective opportunities for us to decarbonize or reduce carbon pollution. So focusing on electricity generation and, of course, transmission is a key part of greening up our grid. Robust transmission grid needs to allow those new resources to connect, to allow the retiring, older, or dirtier generators to exit the system. And it needs to support this new mix of generators. So when we have a different mix of generators, we need to have a slightly different grid, not only in terms of connecting those specific locations of the new generators, but also just, I think of it sort of like a bridge or a truss. We need a more robust and stronger grid to support stable operations with this new clean energy mix. Really, the situation is that when we have wind and solar resources, largely weather-driven resources, there's a lot more variability in terms of the operation of those resources. And that it requires basically more support from the transmission grid. So that's another piece of how we need to adjust our grid to move into this new clean energy future. And I want to highlight here, there are a number of studies these days that that really have looked at what's needed, you know, various sorts of planning studies, evaluating what transmission is needed in the future. MISO's own study, the image that you see in the lower right here, just shows the amount of new transmission solutions that are going to be needed as we increase the percent of clean energy on our grid. But I also noted here Princeton University Zero Lab recently came out with a report that says that we're going to need to double the rate at which we're expanding this grid in order to meet just the goals in the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're going to need a lot more transmission in order to move into this future. So let's go to the next slide. The other thing that I really want to highlight here as we start out is the idea that our grid needs to be bigger than our weather systems. Because we're moving to resources that are really weather driven or weather fueled, we need a grid that's going to be a little bit bigger than that. So typically we've had electricity resources fairly close to load. We're going to have those resources farther away from consumers or load centers like large cities. So when we have more wind and solar on the system, we need to be able to move that power both and when we have excess and also daily as the generation changes. So largely when we're talking about wind, especially in the MISO footprint around the Great Lakes, our wind resources are the best in the northern part of the footprint and to the western part of the footprint. So when we have excess wind power, the wind is really blowing strongly, we need to move that power from the west to the east, and we need to move that power from the north to the south. We don't have many wind resources at all yet in the south. It's possible that we will have more generators down there, but they won't have the same kind of capacity or ability to generate power because the wind is just not as strong in our south. So let's go to the next. Similarly, we're going to need to be able to move solar power. Of course, our solar resources are better in the south. So when we have excess solar power in the south, we need a grid that we can move that excess power to the north. Again, part of this is about low-cost resources, being able to move that low-cost power, that zero fuel cost power to consumers. And also the other thing that we see with solar, especially at high penetrations of solar, is that it moves across our country. We know this. We know that the sun moves across the country during the day, so that when, for instance, the sun is shining in the eastern part of the footprint, but it's just beginning to rise in the western part of the footprint, and maybe customers are just getting up and turning on the heat or cooking their breakfast, we can move that power from the east to the west. And at the end of the day, when the sun is going down in the east, but we still have sun in the west, we want to be able to move that excess power from the west to the east. So that's just a function, particularly of solar power on a daily basis. Okay, the next image. The other reason that we need the grid to be bigger than the weather systems is to be able to move the power between regions, especially during extreme weather events. You all are familiar, I'm sure, with Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott, and most recently Heather in this last January. When we have extreme weather events like this, and we've got regions that are really challenged to keep generation online and to meet the excess demand that they're seeing from their customers, we need our regions to be able to assist. So we need to have strong transmission connections between our regions so that we can move that power and help our neighbors during these extreme weather events. And as well, once we reach higher penetrations of renewables, we're going to want to move not only that excess power across regions, but sometimes between regions. Let's move to the next one. This last slide that I have, it's just to kind of highlight a couple other topics related to grid evolution. Once we plan the grid that we need for the future, it is a long process to actually put in place those new transmission lines. Typically takes between 3 and 10 years. Transmission siting, transmission permitting, Tyler's going to talk more about that. But also, we're going to need a lot of people to build these new transmission lines. So it's going to be a great economic opportunity, especially in rural areas where a lot of money is going to go into building this new infrastructure to serve our future. Both demand response and electric vehicles, demand response basically are large industrial loads, but sometimes also aggregated consumer load that utilities are managing that we can adjust to help balance the grid. I mentioned that we're going to have more variability in our generation because wind and solar are variable. So we need to always keep load and demand, demand and supply balanced, and loads that can respond to price or can be adjusted will help us to keep that balance. Similarly, electric vehicles, once the technology is really fully developed, will also be able to help us balance the grid. And in both of those cases, it may also be able to help us avoid need to build extra generation for the peak periods when we have just a little bit of extra need, say at the hottest part of the day or the coldest part of the day. And lastly, one of the things that we're seeing, which is also, I think, going to impact the grid that we need to plan, as well as the generation that we need to build, is we're getting more and more loads on the system, more and more demand from new large loads like data centers, but also electrification of home energy use, and of course, the need to charge those electric vehicles. So all of these things are things that we need to think about as we see the grid evolving, both in terms of generation and the transmission that we need to build. And I do have one more slide that's got my contact information in case anyone wants to follow up with me later. I'm going to have to jump at the very end of the call to catch a plane. But I know, Adam, I think you're wanting us to hold questions till the end. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Natalie. All right, Jeremiah, you are up next. And let me know.
Okay. Let's see if I have any luck with technology.
All right. Just in case. Good. Oh, hey, look at that. All right.
Are you able to see that?
We can see it, and it is, yeah, it's not necessarily in a presentation form, but we can see it just fine. So I say oh, it's because it's a PDF, right?
Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Perfect.
Yeah, that's better.
So is it showing, just to confirm, I'm on slide 2?
Yeah.
So, okay. Good morning, everyone. Jeremiah Donor here for MISO. I'm going to build off of Natalie's great kind of overview of the grid and kind of go a little bit more deeper into how does MISO fit into that? What is MISO seeing from the system changes that we're seeing? How are we trying to plan for that and really dive more specifically into the transmission piece of that? What are we doing to plan for that transmission system of the future that we need based on where the resources are going, where the load is going? And then also kind of give you a little bit of an overview of our most recent really case study and how we've put that into action in identifying transmission lines to keep that moving. Because as Natalie said, transmission lines, optimistically, you're in that 8 to 10 year time frame when you're really talking about the highway type of transmission, 345 kV, 765 kV, that Tyler's going to talk about more on the state side, but those can take a long time to actually get in service. So it really talked through the importance of being proactive in building out our transmission system. So first, just wanted to level set on MISO and what does MISO do, and what is our where do we fit into the overall electricity system. So MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, as the map shows, we're really run through the middle of the US. So we go from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, covering about 15 states through the middle there. We serve 40 million people. So in that 45 million people, in that region. And so we have to work closely across kind of a diverse set of stakeholders. When you think about those 15 states, obviously there's diverse interests in drivers at those states, and utilities are wanting, so we have to manage those across that footprint. The main thing from an RTO perspective, kind of the three big things that I like to think about an RTO does is, at first and foremost, we're wanting to keep the lights on. So obviously overseeing the reliability of the electricity grid for that 15-state region. So we're monitoring the transmission system. We're dispatching generation as needed to meet the load and making sure that everything stays reliable. And that's our primary objective for this 15-state region. Now, at the same time, we want to make sure that we're doing that in an efficient manner, so a cost-effective manner. So MISO operates multiple different markets to make sure that we're delivering that energy in a reliable and a cost-effective way. So across those multiple markets, we're clearing annually about $40 billion. And so MISO itself doesn't own anything. So I think that's an important thing too to remember is MISO is just the independent operator of the system, but ultimately we don't own any generation, we don't own any transmission lines. We serve at our memberships, our member utilities, and so they're the ones that continue to own and operate that generation to transmission. But we're kind of overseeing and implementing these markets and operating the system independently. And then finally, the one we're going to talk about more today is our role in transmission planning. And so we are the entity that's responsible for doing that regional transmission planning for this area. So we work closely with our member utilities and states on doing that. And so that's a major role that MISO fills to try to think ahead and plan out the transmission system of the future. So as Natalie talked about, we all know that there's, from a policy perspective, there's huge drivers to change how we meet our electricity needs. And so MISO is no different than many other parts of the country. When you look across our 15 states, our utilities and states have these very aggressive policy goals to move from the generation fleet of old to new that's much, from a decarbonization perspective. So moving from resources that are more carbon intensive to resources that are not emitting those carbon. So thinking about wind, solar, especially those are the two resource technologies that we currently see that our members and states are planning to make that transition. We see in the future potentially other technologies helping to meet those needs. But right now, what we're seeing in MISO footprint is predominantly it's wind and solar is what our members are planning to make that transition. So if you look across the MISO footprint, over 70% of our load, our utilities, have some form of a decarbonization plan. Obviously, that varies across the utilities and states. But when we recently did a study looking out 20 years, we found in our footprint that when you aggregate all of these utility plans and state plans, we're looking at over that time horizon into 20 years, a 75% decarbonization. So if you compare our decarbonization amounts from 2005 to 20 years out, there's a 75% reduction. And so obviously that's a very significant change across our footprint. And as Natalie talked about, when the resources that we've had in the past to meet our electrical needs are very different than the resources that we're going to see in the future. In particular, when you think about wind and solar, obviously those are weather dependent, and those are not able to follow as closely the dispatch signals that we would send historically to our units. So when you think about more coal, nuclear, gas units, those are able to, by their nature, respond more directly up and down to dispatch signals. But with the resources that we see in the future, wind and solar, those are going to be more weather dependent, we like to say. And really that's where you see the value of transmission coming into play. When you're able to have that more robust transmission system, you can help manage as weather fronts move across, as the sun is setting, for example, with solar. the transmission system allows you to manage that. And so that, with that shift in the resources that we are seeing in the future, which is driven by a lot of these plans, member plans and state plans that we have in our footprint, MISO about 3-4 years ago recognized that we needed to have a more kind of coordinated, defined action plan with our members to address how MISO has functioned in the past and how MISO has planned the system in the past isn't going to work for the future. And so what do we need to change in how MISO operates and MISO plans to address this changing resource fleet? And so this isn't just an area where we need to change how we plan the transmission system. It's really MISO's looking at it across all functions that we do. So I'll focus more on what we've done on the transmission planning piece of this, of these 4 items that we have here. But I just wanted to highlight that this doesn't just impact how we plan the transmission system. MISO's looking at, well, do we need to make changes to how we operate from day to day to ensure that we maintain reliability? So in our control room that is housed 24/7, 365, do we need to change the tools that our operators have? And so we're exploring that. From our market, are we making sure that we're still operating the market efficiently, sending the right signals to what we need to make sure we maintain reliability? So evaluating our different markets. And then obviously the transmission piece. And so on the transmission piece, that's one where we're trying to look out ahead and say, okay, we know where the resource fleet is wanting to go. How can the transmission system support us getting there? And so that's the piece I'm going to dive into more, is just what we've done on the transmission planning side of this to address that changing resource fleet. So first, when we think about long-term transmission planning, the slide here just kind of lays out what are our really core objectives. And when we approached our long-range transmission planning effort that we kicked off in 2021, obviously the main thing that we're focused on is how do we make sure that we ensure reliability? So that's our primary objective, is looking out ahead and saying, well, how can transmission help us ensure that we're able to maintain that reliability? And then at the same time, how can transmission allow our members to more cost effectively make this transition? So as we'll show later, with a robust transmission system, there can be a lot of cost savings that our members are able to take advantage of. It's really around that footprint diversity that MISO's large region offers. So maybe our members don't have to build as much wind or solar right in their local footprint because they're able to take advantage of resources that are in other parts of our footprint. So how can the transmission system help support that from an efficiency standpoint? And then how can we lay out the transmission system? I like Natalie's reference to the highway. And that's really how we look at long-range transmission planning, is how do we lay out proactively the highway to lay that foundation so that as decisions are made in the future about specific, resource locations, or there are specific areas where there is load growth of data centers, for example, is something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about lately. But how do we lay out that foundation with the highway and let those future decisions about the on-ramps and off-ramps onto that highway happen in the future, but we have that backbone there from a highway perspective. So you may ask, well, how do you think about and plan 20 years in the future? What do you have to do that? And so the first step in that process that we do with working with our members is laying out, where do we think that future is going? And a lot of us are engineers. I'm an economist. We're not really that creative, so we call them futures. And we actually just number them, future 1, 2, and 3. And what those different futures are doing is getting input from our members and states about what are your plans for the future looking 20 years out? What do you think your resource mix is going to be? What do you think your load growth is going to be? Obviously, with the shift around electrification, electric vehicles, that's driving a lot of load growth. We're seeing a lot of data centers with AI and just other things around the driving data centers that's driving a lot of load growth. But we get all of that input into our models, and we make different assumptions around the future around, well, how aggressive are these decarbonization targets going to be? Okay, so that lays out different futures around the resource mix. How quickly and to what level do we think electrification is going to happen? So what's the electric vehicle penetration going to be? That's going to drive differences in load growth. And so that is a difference across those futures. And so we build each of these futures. We look out 20 years, we build the resources that's needed to meet that. And then that's a critical input into our models that we do the transmission planning and start identifying what we're going to need in the grid to support that. I wanted to focus here on really our what we call Future 2A, and Future 2A is currently what we're focused on from looking at the transmission system, and that's really the foundation there is meeting all of our member plans and state goals from a decarbonization perspective, assuming a I would say, pretty significant load growth from an electrification perspective. And if you see the pie charts on the right, that's really illustrating the magnitude of the change and then also the shift in the resources that are meeting all of that energy requirements. So the top bubbles there, pie charts, are 2023. So that's more of a existing, what resources do we have on the system? How are we meeting the energy requirements? And you see that about 2/3 of our existing fleet and existing energy requirements are being met by coal and natural gas. That's where we're at today. We're seeing a much higher percentage, continuing higher percentages of wind and solar, but that's currently more in the 20% bucket. But if you see where our futures are telling us we're going in 2042, it's a massive shift. I mean, the industry hasn't seen this shift ever, and the pace that we're being asked to do this is unprecedented. But when we're looking at 2042, you see now we've shifted to 2/3, 75% of our capacity and energy is from wind and solar. So that's a massive shift. That's also important to note that if you look at the energy production amount, that's a 50% increase in energy over that 20-year period. And so that's reflecting that growth from electrification. And so we kind of have multiple factors that are really stressing the system from that resource changes. One, we're asking to flip over the types of resources, and then at the same time, we're being asked to have to meet significant increase in our energy requirements from that new set of resources. So this lays the foundation for all of our planning studies. So what we do from here is we start building models that look at, okay, what issues do we see on the system? What kind of reliability issues are created with this new resource fleet? What transmission do we need to address that? And I'll kind of give you the short, or you're getting the super short version today. I could talk about these topics for days. So I'll kind of skip ahead to an example of the end product after we went through about 18 months of work with our stakeholders and analysis. Where we landed recently to start that, make that first step on what's that grid of the future going to look like. And so in July of 2022, MISO finished what we, again, creatively called our Tranche 1. This was our first phase of our long-range transmission planning effort. And so this took those futures that I was just talking about and said, okay, with the resource mix and the load growth of the future, what transmission system do we need to support that? And so this portfolio that you see here represents about $10 billion of investment. That's over 2,000 miles of new 345 kV transmission. And that's really, again, that's to lay out that highway so that we can, reliably and cost effectively meet that resource transition that we see here in the Midwest. This first portfolio did focus on our Midwest part of our footprint. There were some different drivers there from just where the Midwest is versus our south part of our footprint in this resource transition. So we started with our Midwest, and I guess in particular for this group, this heavily hits those Great Lakes states. Okay. And so this, like I said, this was the culmination of about 18 months work, planning study work. MISO approved that in July of 2022. And so Tyler's going to talk about it next, but all of these projects are now going through the state process to get that final permitting process so that they can actually get in service. And so we're hopeful that these projects will be in service by 2030. Obviously, a lot of things have to go right to make that happen from the state permitting process. Another area that we are monitoring closely and worried about is just all of the supply chain constraints that we have. So that's kind of across the board. We've all felt the pains of supply chain, but in particular, when you think about what's happening across the globe and the demands on transmission equipment, that's going to be a big challenge that we have to closely monitor because it's not just happening in the Midwest. So those were the groups of projects. You may ask, how do we get support from our customers to support making a $10 million infrastructure investment? How do you get support for that? Why should I fund this? And so one of the key pieces of the study is we call it our business case. And it's really to look at the value the transmission is providing across multiple different values. That's why we call them multi-value projects, is to look at the value the transmission has across multiple components and show that, okay, across the Midwest, the ratepayers are going to see benefits well in excess of costs. And for this portfolio, we focused on 6 different types of investment. Those go from market efficiency types of benefit, congestion relief. Are you able to fully access the wind and solar? They're not curtailed, so you're able to get that value to reduce capital investment. So you're not having to put in as many wind turbines or as many solar panels. So there's a savings there. Also, this transmission in particular can really help during extreme weather events. So capturing the value that transmission gives you during those extreme weather events to have more flexibility on the system. And so how can you avoid load shed or avoid somebody's lights going out during those weather events with this transmission? And so for this portfolio, we showed benefits over a 2.0 benefit cost ratio. I know one of the more challenging things to do, you would think the engineering is challenging, but one of the more challenging things to do is really trying to quantify the dollar value transmission provides. It's something that the industry historically hasn't done a lot of. They've really focused on, if you don't upgrade this transmission line, the lights are going to go out, so you need to fix this. And so everybody just agreed, well, yeah, we don't want the lights to go out, so we'll invest in that. This is longer term transmission, and obviously $10 billion is a large investment. So really have to show from a dollar perspective what ratepayers are getting for that. So we think this is an important piece of it. At the same time, it is complicated work to do. And then finally, I wanted to touch on my last slide. I know in my bio it mentioned that I spent a lot of time thinking about transmission cost allocation. And at the end of the day, that probably is one of the biggest risks to actually getting transmission investment in service is agreeing on who benefits and who should pay. Because at the end of the day, it always comes down to who's going to pay for this. And so transmission cost allocation is a piece that we do have to spend a lot of time working with our members, with our states, to understand why it makes sense for their ratepayers to invest in this transmission. And so I showed you the waterfall chart that we have with all the different benefits of the group of projects and what benefits it provides. But given that everybody in the Midwest is paying for these projects, we really have to get a little more granular to support that cost allocation question. And so one of the things we do is looking at those projects and how do they benefit those states that are funding those projects. And so this chart here shows across, the states that are funding this: Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin, our northern states. How are those specific states and the customers in those states benefiting from those projects? And it really helps with that cost allocation discussion around why their customers should support this and the benefits they're getting from it. And so this was kind of the current case study that we have around Tranche 1. This was a great first step for the Midwest in investing in the transmission grid. Our work hasn't stopped. So we are currently right in the middle of the next phase, what we like to call our Tranche 2. And so we're looking at that next phase of transmission to build off of this Tranche 1 transmission. And so we're hopeful to have that study completed by the end of this year, so that we can continue on meeting our needs of our members in the future. So with that's all of my slides, and I'll hand it over to Tyler to wrap us up, and then we can get to the questions.
All right. Thank you, Jeremiah.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremiah. All right, Tyler, let's see.
Yep, I think I can do mine. Let's see. Okay. Can
Looks
everybody see
good.
that?
Yep.
All right, great. My name is Tyler Huebner. I was a commissioner in the state of Wisconsin for about 4 years up until January, and excited to be here today. Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to cover 3 topics today. Sorry, I got to move something on my screen. I'm going to kind of continue the theme that Natalie and Jeremiah have talked about regarding energy resources and the availability of those resources. I've got some maps to share as well. A couple minutes on Wisconsin and geographically and energy-wise where we sit, and kind of why transmission is important, where it fits in for the Badger State. And then finally, the bulk of my time, I want to talk about the process, the regulatory and permitting process for a state like Wisconsin. It's obviously different in every state that you might encounter, but relatively similar, I would guess, to the types of reviews that most states would be going through. Okay, now I got to figure out how to advance the slide. Okay, can you still see that?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, now we're going. Okay, so I've got 4 charts here, 4 maps. And I'll start with the map kind of in the middle with the big red splotches. This is where the coal resources are in the United States of America. And as you can see, as you look at a state like Wisconsin, we have no coal resources. So historically, we're a state that's been heavily dependent on coal, but we've brought that coal in, as you can see by my little graphic on the left, on trains. So we are importing energy on a train to burn in power plants in Wisconsin and provide electricity to our customers. Going down one to natural gas, that's the one with all the blue. Similarly, Wisconsin has no natural gas in the state, and so we also import natural gas. Now that comes through my nice graphic on the left. That's a pipeline. A lot of the pipelines are below the ground. You don't see them. This one is in construction. It looks like it might end up being above ground, but a lot of the pipelines you don't see. But similarly, we are importing energy in the form of natural gas to heat homes and businesses, but also increasingly to use in power generation. And because we don't have any of those resources, we are importing that in another way. On the right are my two graphs or pictures showing on the top wind resources. And on the bottom right, there is solar resources. And as you can see, the solar resource is relatively pervasive throughout the United States. Certainly it's a higher, the closer you get down to the equator in the south, and then in the southwest, just the weather patterns have a lot less cloud cover throughout the year. And so the resource is stronger. But as you again look at a state like Wisconsin, you know, that's a long ways to run a transmission line from the southwestern United States up to Wisconsin. And so what you're seeing really across the country is solar is getting built everywhere, certainly on rooftops, but also increasingly as the costs have come down, ground mounted arrays of all sizes. In the upper right is the wind resource. Now the wind resource can be measured at different heights above ground. Generally speaking, the higher up you put your wind turbines, the more windy it is. I opted just to do one map. There are other maps that show Wisconsin has decent wind resource, not white and nothing. We do have some resource, but this particular map also shows the offshore, so you can kind of see the thick lines off the coasts, Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of areas of the country that don't have nearly as good a wind resource as what we call the wind belt here, from the Dakotas and Montana, western Minnesota, Iowa, straight down through West Texas. That is the best wind resource in the world, not just the United States. On land, at least. And then as you can see, even that really pales in comparison to the wind resource off the coasts of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, and as well in the Great Lakes. So, you know, the technology for getting offshore wind is developing. Certainly in Europe, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of projects happening out east, Atlantic, off the Atlantic, New York, etc. That really has not developed at all in the Great Lakes. But as you kind of look at that, you know, you realize the wind is kind of locked up in spots where it's windy, and you can't put the wind on a train, and you can't put the wind in a pipe. And so the way you move the wind is through transmission lines. And so just kind of taking that step back to understand why we're talking about transmission is because, you know, we're not going to move coal on trains in 20 years, as Jeremiah said. That most of the members of MISO across the country, utilities, are saying we're not going to use that resource in the future. And so just the raw energy needs to be replaced somehow, some way. If it's going to be with wind and solar, you have to move that energy from, just like on a train, you have to move the coal from where you mine it to where you're going to use it. You have to move the wind energy from where it's windy to where you're going to use it. Okay. There we go. Okay. Wisconsin example. So as I said, we don't have any coal or natural gas in the state of Wisconsin. But this is our mix as of 2020, somewhat similar to what Jeremiah showed. It's about a third coal, about a third natural gas, and about a third everything else, nuclear being the biggest component of that, and wind has certainly grown. If you look back about 15 years ago, though, coal was 70% of Wisconsin's electricity. So it's already declined significantly in the past 10 to 15 years, and most of the electric providers are planning to phase that out in the next 10 to 15 years. And just an example, as Jeremiah showed, these types of kind of political leadership, utility leadership are pervasive. He had a much more comprehensive map, but just what our governor has done, he created an Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy within the state government, and had an executive order in 2019 that said that office is going to work with other state agencies and our utilities to achieve a goal of 100% carbon free by 2050. And, many states, local governments, and utilities have set similar goals in place. And so you think about this chunk of coal in particular is the lower hanging fruit of reducing carbon is likely to go to zero by 2050, and figuring out how to do natural gas with some kind of carbon capture or replacing it with hydrogen is another challenge, but idea on the table. But really the proven technologies that are cost effective that exist today are massive increases of wind and solar, and storing some of that with battery storage. Okay, so going to shift gears now and talk about how a public service commission like the Wisconsin one reviews transmission line projects. And this would be similar for, like, some of the laws are different, but the general concepts here are similar. If you want to build a wind farm, if you want to build a solar project, if you want to build a coal power plant, a lot of our reviews would be the same, but talking here about transmission. So at the highest level, the Public Service Commission is an agency designated by the legislature to do a job. And what our job is safe, reliable, affordable utility service. Oftentimes reliability and affordability can be somewhat in tension, where you can build a much more reliable system, but that's going to cost money. And so there's standards that MISO is working with. Our utilities all have kind of standards as to, quote, how reliable is reliable, and then building, a system to that level and not above that. Commissions like the Wisconsin Commission has authority by the state legislature to issue permits, to do all the reviews and issue permits for construction for energy projects and transmission lines. Certainly the large types of lines that we're talking about would fall under basically every single state is going to have some jurisdiction over that. Our basic job is to ensure that any project that we permit is in the public interest. And that term really dates back to the early 1900s, based on state laws, but also interpretations by the U.S. Supreme Court and a bunch of other courts throughout the country as to kind of what is and what isn't in the public interest as it pertains to service from what is often monopoly or sort of single providers within the geographic territory that we're talking about. So we kind of have laws that break this down into three major buckets. First, that there is a need for the project. So the applicants have to demonstrate that this project is truly needed and that the electricity is going to be used to serve the public in an adequate fashion, and that without this project, it will either be more expensive or not possible to serve the public going forward. The second is that it's economically viable, that the benefits are worth the costs. Obviously, all of these types of projects cost money, but the question is, are they cost effective? I like to say, is the juice worth the squeeze on that one? And then the third one is we do a lot of reviews, I'll talk about on the next slide, to make sure that no other public interest detriment is identified that really kind of outweighs the need for this particular project or the benefits. In other words, if something is identified, then maybe there's another way to meet the need or another way to provide the benefits, but some certain aspect may preclude a certain spot or location geographically in a state. Okay. So a little bit of process, and if you start following Public Service Commission cases across the Great Lakes, the process is just part of what you'll want to understand. The way it works in Wisconsin is that we have what's called parties, and to be a party is an official term, a legal term. The PSC is like a quasi-judicial agency. All of our decisions can be appealed to courts, including all the way up to our state Supreme Court. And so we have a very legal process. And so if you are a party, then you can bring your own technical expertise to the table and you can cross-examine other witnesses. Meaning you can ask them questions. You can try to poke holes in the analysis that they may have completed. You can also then submit legal briefs and really make the legal arguments based on the laws of the state. Here's why we think our position is superior. Often in a big transmission case, you'll obviously have the applicant. That could be one utility company, or it could be a consortium of utilities that are co-owning or co-building a project. In the past, we've seen a lot of local governments get involved. Obviously, this is passing through counties or maybe skirting municipalities or large cities, and often they have interests that they want to protect. You see residential and small business ratepayer advocacy groups. Sometimes these are attorney general's offices or other state-based employees that are advocating for the general public. In Wisconsin, we have a nonprofit group that's called the Citizens Utility Board, and I think Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, a lot of other Great Lakes states have a group that's called their state Citizens Utility Board. You'll often see large industrial customers. These customers pay very large energy bills and have an interest in making sure that their bills aren't going up without reason. You'll have environmental organizations kind of spanning the gamut from groups that are advocating for renewable energy, groups that are advocating for solutions to climate change. But then you'll have other groups, state-based or regional or even local, that are kind of opposed to these projects. At least we've seen that in Wisconsin, where a certain special place or a certain land or a certain water body they want to protect. And so they don't want a project to be located near or on that. Also, we've seen a lot of individual citizens in the locations where the lines are going to get built. In Wisconsin, you don't actually have to be a licensed attorney to be a party or an attorney before the PSC. So we've had a number of individuals come in and be a full party and cross-examine, and the wife will be the attorney, and they'll call their husband, who's maybe a retired botanist or retired environmental engineer or something, who will be their expert witness. We've seen that. And then citizens also have the chance to offer public comments. So they can do that either in person. We often have public hearings for basically every large project, at least one. And sometimes I'll show a case study where we had 5 public comment sessions, or they can use our website or send a letter in. And all of those comments become part of the official record that commissioners then do read. We have a number of statutory requirements that the state commissions have to follow. So here's some examples in Wisconsin. We have to produce an environmental impact statement. So for a project, I'll tell you about a 2014 project. There was a transmission line that was about 100 miles long. A 400-page environmental impact statement was developed. There was public information sessions along the route of that project so that locals could get engaged and learn about the project. The types of things it looks at is the ecological balance and how the project will affect plants, animals, etc. Public health and welfare, identifying any historic sites, special geologic formations, the general aesthetics of the land or water bodies, that could be rivers, lakes, etc. Any recreational use, so we're talking about trails, snowmobile paths, cross-country skiing, you name it. Will the project impact kind of recreational use, boating, obviously, if we're talking about water bodies. Local planning is a factor. So local governments have to do comprehensive plans every 10 years in the state of Wisconsin. And the PSC has to make sure that these facilities would not unreasonably interfere with their orderly land use and development plans. So for example, if a city's designated like a new industrial park they want to build, and you want to put an applicant wants to put a transmission line or a solar project right on top of it, that might not actually fit with the local plans that are in place. In addition, the Ag Department issues an agricultural impact statement. How will this impact farmland in the state of Wisconsin? And usually our permits aren't the only ones they need. In fact, almost in every case. So Department of Transportation, anything to do with state highways, you'll need permits from them. Waterways and wetlands permits to cross over them, to be sure that whatever construction you're doing, if you're moving dirt around, that a big rainstorm comes in the middle of your project, that the dirt's not going to run off into the local rivers and lakes. handling stormwater, permits for endangered or threatened species through our Department of Natural Resources. In addition, a lot of these larger projects require federal permits too. So that could be the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the FAA for airplanes and impacts there. And then a Wisconsin law, once we get into siting and routing, Wisconsin requires 2 different routes to be brought forward by those applicants. So they have to identify electrically they're connecting point A to point B, but there's 2 ways on the land to get there. And they've got to do all the work to be sure that both routes are viable and permittable routes. And then it's the Public Service Commission's chooses the superior route. The route with either the least cost, the least impacts, kind of balancing all of these statutory requirements to get the route that's the most in the public interest. And then in Wisconsin, we also have a law citing that there's a preference for following existing highways or using existing transmission line right-of-ways, so that we're not really going through green fields. We're trying to avoid that to the maximum extent possible in Wisconsin. And then to just close up with a little timeline of kind of how this process unfolds. This is for a project that was in, Jeremiah talked about LRTP, the long range transmission planning, and that's what's happening now. But about 12 years ago, there was a analogous version that was called the MVP, the multi-value projects. There were 17 lines across the Midwest in that portfolio as well. This was one of them that was in Wisconsin. The initial notice, I looked back, was filed in August of 2010. So sort of electrically, and I think maybe through the MISO process, it had been determined, hey, this will be a cost beneficial line as early as 2010. It took the transmission companies 3 full years to start actually filing anything with us. So that's their work on the ground, identifying the actual routing, siting, getting, landowners, leases for their land and how they were going to cross over, easements, those kind of things. 3-year process there. And then once they started actually filing all the stuff with us, our staff has to review it, the PSC staff. And that was like another 9-month process before the PSC's staff said, okay, you've actually filed everything that you need to file for us to even fully review this. So you can just imagine the volume and the level of detail that's required to even have a fully complete application. Once it's deemed complete, it starts a 360-day clock. So the commission has a full year to review all of this. It took us about 3 to 4 months to draft the environmental impact statement. That goes out for a comment period to the public. And then that was finally issued in November of 2014. 5 public hearings were held in December. The technical experts were all really cross-examined in January. And then the parties get to file their briefs by the end of January. And then about 2 months later, the Public Service Commissioners actually take up the project and determine, they've reviewed the whole record, everything that has been filed, and make a decision. And then about a month later, the written decision was issued. And then that, like I said, can be appealed. And in this case, it was appealed to the courts, but ultimately it was upheld. And then, so once those utilities gets their permit from us, it was about a 3-year process to build the project, and it finally was placed in service in December of 2018. So you can kind of see, going back to when MISO had first identified this project is basically over 8 years before it was in the ground and operational. All right, that's all I have for you, and way over time. Sorry about that. Looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tyler and Jeremiah and Natalie. So folks, you know the drill. Let me know you have a question in the chat. And we might front load a few questions if they're specifically for Natalie, because she has to jump off the earliest. And yeah, you guys you guys take it away so that I can stop talking. Thank you, Kelly House. You're first.
Hi, I'm just wondering, there was talk about cars being able to help like balance out demand by feeding energy back into the grid. Do we have a sense of when that technology, is it viable now, or when do we think that's going to be a really viable thing?
I don't have a good answer for that. I don't think it's particularly viable now, but similar to the way other batteries can store power and then deliver it back later, we expect that that will happen. I don't know, Jeremiah, if MISO has a better handle on that in terms of their planning.
So on our end, I would say obviously at this point in time, not something that's viable that I know of. I think there's obviously some studies that shown theoretically how can we leverage that. There may be some more localized case studies that people have done, but from MISO's perspective, like currently we don't have something like that in our planning studies that we're assuming. I think that technology, like a number of other things, we're waiting for those to mature. Those would also be I don't know if Tyler has any experience from Wisconsin of discussions that have happened, but that would too also be something that may be more seen on the distribution side that maybe MISO isn't as directly involved with from the transmission side.
All right. Thank you, guys. Luann has a question.
Yeah, I had two questions. I was wondering how long it actually takes to move electricity that's generated in one part of the country to another, like from the wind belt down to the south or something. Like what's the actual time that it takes? And then I was looking at that grid of where MISO operates and wondering why that chunk of northwestern Illinois and that little chunk of southwestern Michigan is not part of MISO. Just curious.
Yeah, so on the first question, and that's one of the challenges of keeping the system balanced from an electricity perspective, is electricity moves at the speed of light. So things happen very quickly when you're moving electrons across the transmission lines. And so that's why it's always amazing the more you know about how reliable the electricity system is, because of having to instantaneously keeping everything in balance. And then your second question, so that's a legacy item from how RTOs originally formed. So the grayed out area that I showed you in the map for MISO, that is Commonwealth Edison, so Chicago, and AEP Indiana, Michigan. And so those utilities, when whole kind of 20 plus years ago, RTOs were forming, they made the decision to become part of what's called PJM. So it's performs a very similar function for predominantly states that are to the east of the MISO footprint. And so those two utilities decided to join PJM. Again, RTO membership is all voluntary. So utilities get to make those decisions based on their own kind of business model, economics, which RTO they want to be part of.
All right. Thanks, Jeremiah. Kyle has a question for everyone.
Yeah, I'm not sure who might be, best able to answer this. I mean, it sounds like in terms of, building up and improving our current transmission system, that there's a lot of challenges from, the funding, emerging technology, the permitting on the state side, as well as some of the goals that states have put in place. I was just wondering if there were any, one aspect, if there's any singular aspect that presented particular concerns and what was being done, now to try and mitigate that concern moving forward.
I can throw one out there. I think MISO is doing an excellent job here in the Great Lakes and this region of actually doing forward-looking planning. One of the challenges that we're seeing in other parts of the country is that they aren't, Jeremiah played down the phrasing of just calling it futures. Well, other RTOs don't even do that. They don't look out even 10 years to say what's the future going to look like. They're just kind of operating the markets as is. And so I think the forward-looking planning in places like PJM, the Northeast, and then the other challenge that that exists is that a big chunk of the country, the Southeast, and then kind of, as Jeremiah said, there's PJM, kind of Washington, DC, East Coast over to MISO. There's MISO, then there's another one called SPP. But once you get to like Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, all the way over to California, those states are not in an RTO either. And so they don't have a centralized planning function. It's all every utility for themselves. And so just as Natalie kind of talked about, this is now a national situation. The grid's got to be bigger than the weather. We got to move so much power instantaneously because we're not going to move it on trains and in pipes anymore. That we're going to have to figure out how to plan across these regions that have all done things differently. To me, that's the biggest challenge. And once we get the planning and identification of the projects, there's these processes, procedures, they take time, but those are actually pretty well understood. I think the stuff that isn't done as well as it needs to be is just this high level future-based planning to identify the specific, what points on the grid actually need to be connected? What's the cost-effective way to find the points A, B, and C to connect? That's my perspective, so.
Yeah, if I could just maybe add a little bit onto that. I mean, we've all highlighted and Tyler just reiterated, like this is a long process to plan, to permit, to site, to build these lines. And we really do have to plan in advance, because if we wait until the time that we actually need it and start then, we'll be 8 or 10 years behind. So, so there's lots of different challenges, but I want to highlight one that is a continual challenge, which is the cost allocation piece that Jeremiah mentioned. It's not just a situation of, you know, me as a homeowner, do I want to invest in a new, you know, energy efficient heating system for my home, you know, and how am I going to decide whether or not I want to pay that money? We're talking about a situation where we've got multiple states involved, multiple utilities involved. And unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is that they're like, no, you pay. No, you pay. You know, I'm not the one that's benefiting. And so that part of the conversation, that part of the work to figure out how we're going to divide the costs is very contentious and time consuming. And I also just want to completely agree with Tyler that MISO's been doing a great job of regional planning. We're starting to see other regions think about doing a better job and looking to MISO as an example. But across the country, we need to do a better job of our interregional planning and connecting those regions together for the reasons that I mentioned, you know, emergency events and being able to support neighbors and being able to move this power across the regions, even on a daily basis.
I just want to thank Natalie and Tyler for the plug. Appreciate that.
All right, thanks, Natalie. So, okay, Tom, I'm jumping you real quick so that Sherry can ask her question for Natalie, but then you're going to hold your other question, Sherry, and we'll get back to that one.
No problem. Hi, Natalie.
Hi.
I'm not sure your plane's taking off from Traverse City right now anyway. But
I'm wondering about that myself. I'm looking out the
Yeah,
window
I don't
and
know.
the snow's still coming down.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier that cleaning the grid is an opportunity to really get the most cost-effective energy to customers. And I'm sure you're aware that in Michigan, there's an effort to get some more nuclear back onto the grid. First, you know, namely in the Palisades nuclear plant. So I'm wondering what your take on that is. If you know, if this is really an opportunity to go, you know, the most cost-effective way for customers, really have that in mind for ratepayers while we clean the grid. Because nuclear, you know, that's the big criticism, is it's very expensive. So where should nuclear be fitting into our portfolio as we're cleaning the grid?
Well, I think this is a question that we have to address in each situation. And this is the role of the state commissions to really judge whether or not the utilities have considered all the options and which of those options is the most cost effective. NRDC in particular does see that nuclear may play a role in our clean energy future. As a base load resource, it's online all the time and it doesn't produce carbon, but it has other concerns that we have to take into consideration. We have the disposal issues, and we have costs and insurance. So I think that there are a variety of options to move towards a clean energy future. Nuclear may be one of those, but we really have to weigh those options against each other at the time that utilities are making those decisions. The other thing that I would just sort of add to that is that we're in a situation right now where we're making this transition and we're learning a lot as we go about how each of these resources work, how to operate the grid differently. And we want to caution decisions in the near term for really big investments in thermal plants that are going to be on the grid for a long time, where we may not actually need them if we can transition to other resources like energy storage, battery storage. We're seeing a lot more long-term battery storage in development. It's not quite viable yet. I know that there is a pilot project. I think it's Great River Energy or another utility in Minnesota. But if we invest in new gas plants or new nuclear plants or even reviving nuclear plants right away, we may close off the opportunity to build clean energy resources that could have served the same need. And so there's a lot to weigh there. And this is why we are grateful that we have commissioners and commission staffs that really dig into the details, and utilities that we push to do solid planning to consider all those alternatives.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Tom, you had a question.
Yeah, hey, I was just curious because I know, there's been talk about the number of years of planning. How do you pivot for changes in technology that aren't anticipated, and how that affects the markets? The fracking, the advancements in fracking is a classic example. And also there's been talk about clean coal, whether or not that ever comes to fruition or just remains a buzzword. My point is that the portfolio could be much different 30 years from now than what you expect it today, while you're trying to create a system based on your current understanding.
Yeah, Tom, I'll get it started because I think that's a very good question that we always have to work through in the planning process when we're defining our futures. What do we ultimately identify in the portfolio is, to your point, managing that uncertainty that we all don't have crystal ball that's going to forecast 20 years perfectly. And so we do try to manage that uncertainty in a couple of ways. One big way that we try to manage that is when we look out in the future 20 years, we're not fixing everything to exactly interconnect all of those resources we have in those future, because we know it's going to play out differently. They may be different resource types. They may be located in slightly different areas. And so that's why when we're laying out that long-term plan, we're focused on the highway piece of it, because we know that future decisions will be made with more certainty to identify specifically the type and location of those resources. But that's a tension we're always trying to manage, is making sure, how do we balance that uncertainty that we know that our 20-year future plan isn't correct. And so we try to manage that by, what do we need to do now versus what decisions can we delay to a future time. And so that's why we focus more on the highway and let those on-ramp, off-ramp decisions be made later.
And
The other thing I would, go ahead, Tyler.
well, Tom, did you want to clarify anything there?
No. I was gonna ask for a quick follow-up, but go ahead. I mean, I can ask a question, but if you had something else.
I was just going to add one more thing to what Jeremiah said, that one of the ways that we try to address this uncertainty in our transmission planning is to use scenario planning. So Jeremiah mentioned that they have 3 different futures. So we don't know what the future is exactly going to look like in 20 years from now. But if we look at a range of credible futures and we plan a grid that provides benefits under each one of those futures, then we've kind of addressed some of that uncertainty in the planning process. So, considering, a variety of different paths forward and planning a grid that's going to serve us well under any of those futures.
The quick follow I had is, as a member resident here of PJM country, which I'm sure is a story that you're familiar with, I have to ask the obvious question, what lessons have you learned from the 2003 outage, which crippled our 13 state region in PJM here? And I'm sure it's been the talk of the, other systems throughout the country.
Yeah, Tom, I would think, coming out of that 2003 event, there was obviously numerous lessons learned that we put in play. I mean, MISO at that point in time was really just making our transition into a full RTO. And so we incorporated a lot of those lessons learned from that perspective, in particular around visibility, and making sure we had visibility into what was happening on our system, i.e. MISO, but also what was happening on our neighboring systems. And we learned a lot of importance about coordination from an operations perspective. And I would say also, that event, we took a number of lessons learned, but every time we have some major events, if you think about some of the major winter events that's happened over the last 5 years, every one of those, there's always a lessons learned, and we get together across the industry to look at what happened and what can we learn from that. And we incorporate, improvements based on those experiences. So we try to do that after every major event to continuously improve.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeremiah. I'm gonna keep us moving just to see if we can get the last 2 questions in here. Fatima had a question.
Hi. Yeah, I'm in Toronto, Canada. We have a systems operator here who has also put out this Pathways to Decarbonization future-looking document. One of the things I've seen is, as that energy policy plays out, is communities are hesitant when it comes to thinking about clean energy and considering proposals. And I'm wondering if either of you can speak to how you're engaging with communities and what the challenges you're seeing on the ground when it comes to talking about some big abstract clean energy proposals.
I'm not sure that I have a good answer for this one because I work mostly at the regional and federal level. All I can offer is that I know that there are local environmental organizations that work sort of state to state or even in more local areas that are having conversations with their communities. Also, renewable energy developers are connecting directly with the communities where they might want to build a new wind plant or a solar plant or that sort of thing. So some of those conversations are going on, but I know that there's also still resistance, and we have seen, for instance, individual counties set up siting rules that make it very hard to bring in any kind of a new generation source, but it might be particularly targeted, for instance, at wind because they don't want large turbines in the air, or solar because they're concerned that they might take away land that is used for agriculture, those kinds of things. So you see a lot of different things, but I think that kind of community connection that we see others doing is the most helpful way to address that concern. I don't know, Tyler, if you have any more on that, because I think Wisconsin has had some local siting issues.
Yeah, 2 perspectives, maybe. One, following up on Natalie with siting of particular projects. So if you're a developer, you want to site a solar or a wind project in a certain county or township. Bye, Natalie. Thanks. Good luck with your flight.
Thanks all.
You know, there's a process, and some developers are better than others at engaging with those local communities and helping them understand, you know, exactly what's going to happen and building up the trust that, you know, they're a reputable actor that is going to, you know, take care of the roads, take care of, you know, the neighbors, make sure the project is done in a way that is going to be fitting in with the community and not sort of just an outsider coming in to build something and then run away. We have a flip of that though in Wisconsin, where because the state really hasn't done, before Governor Evers came in with his executive order, you know, the state had really not moved forward on energy transition for like a decade with any legislation or anything. And so we had local governments, county governments, cities, Milwaukee, Madison, you know, those kind of places, Eau Claire, Green Bay, all developing their own sustainability plans, energy improvements, doing energy efficiency, putting solar on every building they could find. You know, they were really the leaders. So we had local governments that were sort of looking up and getting no support from the state or the feds for periods of time and saying, well, we're just going to be the leaders for ourselves. And so we've got some of the, like the county here around Madison, between solar and bioenergy and biogas, landfill. I mean, they've done so many projects. It's amazing. So I don't know if you've got some of that going on in your area too, where you've got local governments that have been really blazing the trail in the absence of projects or ideas coming from above. So just throw that out there too.
I would just add on from MISO's perspective, we don't get involved directly in those more local discussions that happen from a resource perspective or transmission. Those are the ones, you know, the utilities are taking point on and then working with the states as they go through their permitting process. But MISO does get involved in one of the pieces that can be challenging with especially large multi-state transmission is a particular state understanding why they're funding projects that are in another state. And so MISO does get involved in specific state proceedings to help support that case of what are the benefits of, you know, Illinois funding a project that's in Michigan and vice versa is where we get involved.
As far as I understand, MISO also operates in Manitoba. Is that right?
Correct. We do. Manitoba is part of our footprint as well.
We're gonna get you a Canadian connection, Fatima, eventually. I promise.
Until then, I'll just keep prodding.
Yeah, just keep prodding. Yeah, and it'll happen.
I will say too, we do MISO does do coordination with Ontario. So those are conversations we have from an operations perspective and then also a planning perspective with Ontario.
All right. Thank you guys for that. So we are over time. We have one last question from Sherry. Before I let her ask it, can we just thank Tyler and Jeremiah for being with us? Here's your IJNR golf clap round of applause. We really appreciate your time this morning. And you haven't heard the last of these folks. They'll all get your contact information so they can follow up with questions. If any journalist needs to jump off now, go for it. We will see you in a little under an hour at 11:30 Central, 12:30 Eastern. And with that said, take it away, Sherry.
Hi, thank you very much. I was able to look at some of the long range planning that MISO is doing, and I peeked at the tranche 2 proposals, and the one that really jumped off the page at me was the one that looks like it follows the Badger Ferry route underneath Lake Michigan. And, you know, I'm very curious about what factors would have gone into the decision-making that was the best possible route for this transmission line. given that it would be, underwater and presumably very expensive, rather than, going around through Chicago, which I understand is a very heavily populated area. And then that's the question for Jeremiah. And my question is for Tyler's very much connected, in that in such a proposal, how do you think Wisconsin would react to the idea of long-range transmission line going beneath Lake Michigan, connecting Manitowoc to Ludington? Presumably, it would primarily benefit Michigan, being able to pull wind energy from the Dakotas to the Ludington pump storage facility and store that energy. So I'm just curious about what Wisconsin folks would make of that, because as much as I'm loath to admit it, they've got just as much a vested interest in Lake Michigan as Michigan itself does. So.
Yeah, Sherry, I'll start on the good digging there on where we're at with Tranche 2. Important. We're still kind of at the conceptual stage with Tranche 2. So these are different ideas. We try to start with kind of a big bucket of ideas that looking at where the future is going and what are some of the potential transmission solutions that could support that. And that was one of the ideas that we started with around looking at how, given Michigan's a peninsula, and how do we increase that interconnection strength with Michigan, both to import and export power, right? You mentioned that this line was going into Ludington. That's a great pump storage facility. That's, when you think about long-term storage, pump storage is great at that. So hooking up there, there's benefits there to both Michigan and the broader footprint. And so we said, well, you could run an HVDC line right across Lake Michigan. So that's still, a conceptual idea that we're thinking about. You mentioned the cost. I mean, HVDC lines, they are very expensive. And so that's something that would have to be ultimately weighed in if we wanted to move forward with that. Obviously, there's also a number of, when you're talking about putting a line across the bottom of Lake Michigan, there's technology complications, but there also is permitting complications that would have to be worked through. But you zeroed in on one of the big reasons we looked at an HVDC line across Lake Michigan versus going through Chicago, which is the other way to get through to Michigan, is just also the weighing the complexity of trying to build transmission lines through a major metropolitan area and the complications there. So it's kind of an alternative to going that path that we're still considering.
Yeah, and my take on it, I guess, I can't speak obviously for the whole state or what the Public Service Commission of the future would do, but I think the question of sort of jurisdiction is going to be a big one. It's kind of, obviously, I think if you look at a map, there's a dotted line down the middle of Lake Michigan as what's technically Wisconsin and what's technically Michigan, but I would imagine that the federal permitting process for that is actually going to be far more arduous than either of the two states, just because of the Great Lakes aspect of that. With that said, this was almost unthinkable 20 years ago, but number one, laying internet cables across the bottom of oceans, bodies of water all over the world has obviously happened. They've done that. And the cost effectiveness of doing something like this, there's been a whole bunch of technologies developed as to how to do undersea everything, underwater everything. And so that has really been a game changer. The internet, laying the cables across the Mediterranean, the Baltic, over in Europe, UK, across the Atlantic, it's all been done. So how to do it, and they've taken all that knowledge and they're doing it with offshore wind all over Europe now. They're basically building offshore wind electric grids under the water. So there's a ton of lessons learned, cost effectiveness that would be applied that we would basically jump on top of if this were to be attempted here. in the Midwest. And they're doing it as well, like I said, off the East Coast with offshore wind now too. I mean, those turbines are 15, 20 miles offshore. So, you know, there's a lot of cable that's going to have to be laid for that. So just technologically, I know there's been a lot of advances. How the permitting would go, I think I really can't speak to that, because I think that would be, it would be new for the states and you know, the permitting for the Great Lakes as well, I would imagine. So, yeah. Good
Thanks
question.
very much.
You got
Yeah.
it.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us, like I said, and we really do appreciate this. And I'm looking forward to seeing the stories that come out of this. So journalists, go take a break. Don't look at a screen. We'll see you in a little bit. And Tyler and Jeremiah, thanks so much. It's
Yeah,
much
thank you both. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, everybody.
You're welcome.